My best friend of 19 years carried my son for 9 months, and 6 weeks before his due date, she sat across from my husband and me at our own kitchen table and told us, calmly, like she'd rehearsed it, that she'd changed her mind and intended to keep him. I remember the specific, surreal quality of that moment, watching someone I'd trusted with literally the most important thing in my life explain, in reasonable, measured language, why she now believed she had more right to my biological son than I did. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of the most legally and emotionally complicated ordeal of my entire life. One that pitted me against the person I'd once considered closer than family, over the custody of a child who was genetically mine but carried, for 9 devastating months, in someone else's body. I want to explain how Sophie and I became surrogate and intended parent in the first place, because I think the depth of our friendship beforehand matters enormously to understanding just how devastating her eventual betrayal actually was. Sophie and I met in college, became inseparable within our first semester, and remained genuinely close for the following 19 years, through her 2 marriages, through my own difficult journey with infertility, through more shared milestones and hardships than I could possibly list. When my husband David and I finally exhausted every other fertility option after 6 years of trying, including 3 failed rounds of IVF and a heartbreaking miscarriage at 14 weeks, Sophie was the one who offered, unprompted, entirely on her own initiative, to carry a pregnancy for us using our own embryo. I want to describe what that offer meant to me at the time, because I think it's essential to understanding the full scope of the eventual betrayal. Sophie had always been generous, but this offer represented something beyond even her usual generosity, a genuine, extraordinary gift, offering to undergo pregnancy and childbirth, with all its physical risks and demands, purely to help David and me finally build the family we'd struggled for years to create. I cried for nearly an hour when she first made the offer, genuinely overwhelmed by the depth of what she was proposing to give us. I remember, specifically, the evening she brought it up, the two of us sitting on my back porch after yet another difficult conversation about our exhausted, dwindling fertility options, David inside cleaning up dinner, unaware of the conversation unfolding outside. Sophie had been quiet for most of that evening, and I remember her finally turning to me and saying, "I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I don't want you to feel like you have to say yes right away, but I want to carry a baby for you. I want to actually do this, not just talk about how unfair everything has been." I remember the specific, disbelieving silence that followed, both of us crying together on that porch, a moment I've returned to countless times since everything unraveled, trying to understand how the same woman who offered something this profound could later attempt to take it away. We proceeded carefully, working with a reputable surrogacy agency and separate legal representation for both parties, exactly as responsible surrogacy arrangements require. Sophie had her own attorney, David and I had ours, and we signed a comprehensive gestational surrogacy agreement that clearly established, in explicit legal language, that Sophie was serving purely as a gestational carrier, with no genetic connection to the child given that we were using our own embryo and no parental rights or claims to the child upon birth. I want to emphasize this specific detail because it became centrally important to everything that followed. Sophie had no genetic connection to my son whatsoever. The embryo used in the surrogacy was created using my own egg and David's sperm, meaning that whatever emotional connection Sophie developed during the pregnancy, there was no biological basis whatsoever for any parental claim she might eventually attempt to make. The pregnancy itself proceeded, for the first several months, exactly as we'd hoped. Healthy, uncomplicated, Sophie remaining in close, warm communication with David and me throughout every step, sending updates after every appointment, including us in ultrasounds whenever our schedules allowed, seeming, by every outward indication, genuinely happy to be providing this extraordinary gift for our family. I want to describe the first small sign that something might be shifting, though I didn't fully register its significance at the time. Around the 6-month mark of the pregnancy, Sophie's communication style began subtly changing, slightly more frequent references to her own physical and emotional experience of the pregnancy, occasional comments during our regular check-ins that carried a note of possessiveness I hadn't previously noticed, small linguistic shifts like referring to my pregnancy rather than the more neutral, previously typical language she'd used throughout the earlier months. I mentioned this shift to David around this same period, and we discussed it briefly, ultimately attributing it to the ordinary, expected emotional complexity of carrying a pregnancy to term, understanding, from everything we'd read and discussed with our surrogacy counselor, that even gestational surrogates without genetic connection to the child often develop genuine emotional bonds during pregnancy, bonds that surrogacy counseling and clear boundary setting are specifically designed to help navigate healthily. I want to describe the specific conversation roughly 7 months into the pregnancy, when Sophie first raised what seemed, at the time, like a relatively minor concern, but that I now understand, in hindsight, represented the actual beginning of her shift toward what eventually became a full custody challenge. I've been thinking, she told me, during what I'd assumed would be an ordinary weekly check-in call, about how open the arrangement should be going forward. Like, I know we talked about me being an occasional presence in his life, maybe like an honorary aunt, but I've been feeling like that might not be enough, given everything I'm going through carrying him. I think I need more involvement than we originally discussed. I remember feeling a flicker of unease during this conversation, though I still, at the time, interpreted it as Sophie processing legitimate, complicated feelings about the pregnancy rather than any genuine threat to the custody arrangement we'd carefully, legally established. I told her, gently, that David and I were absolutely open to her having a meaningful, ongoing relationship with our son as he grew up, understanding and honoring the extraordinary role she'd played in bringing him into our lives, while also reaffirming that the legal parental structure, David and me as his parents, Sophie as a beloved, significant presence, but not a parent, remained unchanged from what we'd all originally agreed to. I want to describe the specific evening, roughly 6 weeks before Sophie's due date, when everything fully, devastatingly unraveled. David and I had invited Sophie to dinner at our house, an ordinary, warm gathering we'd hosted regularly throughout the pregnancy, when Sophie, partway through the meal, set down her fork and told us, in a voice carrying a strange, rehearsed calm, that she needed to discuss something serious. "I've been thinking about this for a while now," she said, "and I need you both to understand that I don't think I can go through with the original plan. I don't think I can hand him over after birth. I've felt him grow inside me for 8 months now. I've bonded with him in ways I don't think either of you can really understand, and I think, at this point, I have as much right to be his mother as you do, Rachel, genetics aside." I want to try to describe the specific, vertiginous shock of hearing this statement from someone I'd trusted completely for 19 years, watching her articulate, with apparent genuine conviction, a claim to my biological son that directly contradicted both our extensive legal agreement and the entire foundation of trust our arrangement had been built on. David, who had remained largely silent up to this point, finally spoke, his voice carrying a controlled tension I rarely heard from him. "Sophie, you offered to do this for us. We didn't ask you to become his mother. We asked you to help us become parents, and you agreed to that specific role, in writing, with your own attorney present to make sure you fully understood what you were agreeing to." "I know what I signed," Sophie said, her composure still carrying that same unsettling steadiness. "But I don't think either of you actually understands what carrying a child for 9 months does to a person. You can't understand it, because neither of you has been pregnant. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I think it's true, and I think it matters. Sophie, we have a legal agreement," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to remain composed. "You have no genetic connection to him. This isn't a decision you get to unilaterally make 6 weeks before he's born. I understand there's a legal document," she said, her composure remaining unsettlingly steady throughout this entire devastating conversation. "But I don't think a piece of paper I signed before I actually understood what carrying a child for 8 months would feel like should override what I actually feel now. I think courts consider the birthing parent's wishes more seriously than either of you might be assuming." I want to describe the following weeks, an exhausting, terrifying legal scramble as David and I worked with our surrogacy attorney to understand exactly what legal protections our agreement actually provided, and what genuine risk, if any, Sophie's stated intentions actually posed to our legal parental rights. Our attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Ms. Delgado who specialized specifically in surrogacy and reproductive law, reviewed our comprehensive gestational agreement and provided what became, over the following weeks, a genuinely reassuring, if still stressful, legal assessment. "Your agreement is unusually strong," she told us, during our initial emergency consultation. "Gestational surrogacy with no genetic connection to the surrogate, combined with a comprehensive, properly executed legal agreement establishing your parental rights before conception even occurred, and independent legal counsel for both parties throughout the process. This is exactly the kind of arrangement courts consistently uphold." Sophie's emotional experience during pregnancy, while understandable and not uncommon, doesn't create a legal parental claim absent a genetic connection or some specific defect in the original agreement. I want to describe what it felt like, receiving this legal reassurance while simultaneously still processing the devastating emotional reality of watching my closest friend attempt to claim my son as her own, understanding that even a legally strong position didn't fully protect me from the exhausting, terrifying uncertainty of the following weeks, as Sophie, through her own attorney, formally filed a legal challenge to our surrogacy agreement roughly 10 days after that devastating dinner. Conversation. Sophie's legal argument, once formally filed, centered on a claim that she had experienced what her attorney characterized as a legitimate, unanticipated psychological bond during pregnancy that fundamentally altered her capacity to consent to the original agreement's terms, along with a secondary argument questioning whether the original agreement had adequately addressed the possibility of exactly this kind of emotional development during an extended gestational period. I want to describe the specific agony of navigating the final weeks of Sophie's pregnancy under these circumstances, understanding that my biological son remained, throughout this entire legal battle, inside the body of someone actively working to legally claim him as her own. A level of vulnerability and uncertainty I don't think I can adequately convey to anyone who hasn't experienced something similarly disorienting. David and I attended a court hearing roughly 2 weeks before Sophie's due date, seeking an emergency legal ruling to clarify parental rights and establish clear protocols for the birth itself. Understanding the genuine risk that without such clarity, the hospital and medical staff might face confusion or complications regarding who held legal authority over decisions immediately following delivery. I want to describe sitting in that courtroom, watching Sophie, someone I'd known for 19 years, present her case through her attorney, articulating genuine, apparently sincere emotional distress about the prospect of relinquishing a child she'd carried for 9 months, while simultaneously watching our own attorney methodically, clearly present the legal reality of our comprehensive, properly executed surrogacy agreement. I remember watching Sophie testify, her voice breaking at several points as she described the physical and emotional experience of carrying Ethan, describing feeling his movements, singing to him during quiet moments alone, developing what she characterized as an undeniable, maternal bond that she argued deserved legal recognition regardless of the absence of any genetic connection. I want to be honest that watching her testimony, even knowing the legal reality of our position, was genuinely painful. I didn't doubt that whatever she was describing represented real, felt emotional experience on her part, even as I remained devastated by the specific choice she'd made to weaponize that experience into a legal threat against my own parental rights. Our attorney's presentation, by contrast, remained clinical and thorough, walking the judge through the specific legal protections built into gestational surrogacy agreements precisely to prevent exactly this kind of dispute, along with expert testimony from a reproductive law specialist confirming that courts have consistently, across a well-established body of precedent, upheld properly executed gestational agreements against emotional attachment claims absent genetic connection or evidence of coercion during the original agreement's formation. The judge, a measured, experienced woman who had clearly handled surrogacy disputes before, ultimately ruled in our favor, affirming the legal validity and enforceability of our original gestational surrogacy agreement, while also, notably, ordering that Sophie receive continued access to psychological counseling throughout the remainder of her pregnancy and immediately following birth, acknowledging, even while ruling against her custody claim, the genuine psychological complexity surrogates can experience during extended pregnancies. I want to describe the specific, surreal experience of the actual birth itself, occurring roughly 2 weeks after that court ruling, David and I present in the delivery room alongside Sophie, navigating what should have been one of the most joyful moments of our entire lives under circumstances shadowed by weeks of devastating legal conflict and emotional betrayal. My son, whom we named Ethan, was born healthy, and I want to describe the specific, complicated moment I first held him, an experience I'd anticipated for years throughout our long infertility journey, now arriving wrapped in a complexity and exhaustion I never could have anticipated needing to navigate. Sophie, in the moments immediately following the birth, according to what the hospital staff later described to us, appeared to experience a genuine, difficult emotional collapse, understanding, in that final moment, the full reality of relinquishing the child she'd carried and apparently, by that point, genuinely believed she had some legitimate claim to. I want to be honest about the complicated, layered grief I've carried since this entire situation, understanding that even while the legal outcome protected my parental rights exactly as it should have, the experience permanently, irreparably altered my 19-year friendship with Sophie, a relationship I don't believe can ever return to what it once was, regardless of how the legal custody question was ultimately resolved. I haven't spoken to Sophie since roughly 2 months after Ethan's birth, when she reached out once, in what appeared to be a genuine attempt at reconciliation, expressing what she described as ongoing regret about how she'd handled the entire situation, though her explanation, even then, continued to center primarily on her own emotional experience during pregnancy rather than a full acknowledgement of the specific way her actions had endangered our legal parental rights and caused months of devastating uncertainty during what should have been an unambiguously joyful period of our lives. I want to describe the specific complexity of processing anger towards someone whose underlying psychological experience, genuine, unexpected attachment during pregnancy, I understand, intellectually, is a documented, real phenomenon that surrogacy counseling exists specifically to help navigate, while simultaneously holding on to legitimate, significant anger about the specific choice she made to act on that attachment through a formal legal challenge rather than through the counseling and communication resources that had been available to her throughout the entire process. Ethan is now 2 years old, a healthy, thriving toddler who has no awareness, at his current age, of the legal battle that shadowed the final weeks before his birth. David and I have discussed extensively how and when we might eventually explain his complete origin story, including Sophie's role and the subsequent legal dispute, understanding that this conversation, whenever it eventually happens, will require careful, age-appropriate framing that honors the genuine gift Sophie initially offered us, while also being honest about how that gift ultimately became entangled in a painful legal and emotional conflict. We've decided, for now, to keep detailed photo albums and written records of the entire journey, including Sophie's original, generous offer and the early months of warm collaboration, understanding that Ethan deserves, eventually, a complete and honest account of how he came into the world, one that doesn't erase either the genuine gift at the story's beginning or the genuine complexity that followed it. I want to describe the specific, ongoing complexity of gratitude and grief I carry simultaneously regarding Sophie's role in Ethan's existence. Genuine, permanent gratitude that she offered, initially, an extraordinary gift that made our son's existence possible after years of devastating infertility struggles, alongside real, unresolved grief regarding the friendship I lost, and the specific months of terror I experienced believing my legal claim to my own biological son might genuinely be at risk. I don't think these two feelings will ever fully resolve into something simpler or more comfortable. I've made peace, mostly, with carrying them both indefinitely, understanding that some experiences simply don't offer the clean emotional resolution we might wish for. If you've ever navigated a situation where someone's genuine generosity toward you became entangled in an unexpected, devastating conflict, testing both a significant relationship and your own legal or practical security, I want to hear how you found your way through it. I used to believe that 19 years of deep, tested friendship represented an unshakable foundation, immune to this kind of fundamental rupture. I've learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that even the most extraordinary acts of generosity can become complicated by unexpected psychological developments, and that protecting what matters most sometimes requires legal vigilance even within relationships built on decades of genuine, previously unquestioned trust.